All right, first thing I'll do is on part A, I'll check up under my tractor. I'll check for low hanging lines, wires, and hoses, making sure there's no puddles on the ground, indicating any kind of leaks of any sort. Then I'll check the sitting level of my tractor, make sure it's sitting upright, not leaning to either side, or something that could indicate a low or flat tire, a suspension issue, or a shifted load. Then I'll walk up closer and I'll check the cab lights up top. And on either side, I have my markers, blinkers, and flashers. That's my left-right turn signal, my parking light, and my four-way flasher, making sure they're all properly mounted and secured. Nothing's cracked, bent, or broken. All nuts and bolts should be present and tight. They should all be amber in color and working properly. Then I'll come inward to my high and low beam headlights. Both sides, they should be properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken. All nuts and bolts should be present and tight. They're white or clear in color and they're working properly. And finally, I'm gonna come up to my hood mirrors. I'll make sure that they are both properly mounted and secured. Neither are cracked, bent, or broken. All nuts and bolts should be present and tight. The glass should be clean and they should be properly adjusted. After that, I'll go ahead and open up my hood and we'll go to the passenger side. All right, when I get to my passenger side, the first thing that I'll do is do a general overview of all my lines, wires, and hoses, making sure that they are all properly mounted and secured. Nothing's cracked, bent, or broken. There's no loose connections. I don't hear or see any leaks. Next, I will go straight up to the top and I'll work my way down. Starting at the top, my coolant reservoir. I'll make sure that it is properly mounted and secured. It's not cracked, bent, or broken. The cap is on hand tight. It should be filled to the proper operating level and it should not be leaking. All hoses that are coming from our reservoir should also have no abrasions, bulges, or cuts. They should be properly mounted and secured, and they should not be leaking as well. Coming on down, I'm going to come down to my front exhaust. As far as my eyes can see, I'll check my front exhaust to make sure that it's properly mounted and secured. It's not cracked, bent, or broken. All nuts and bolts should be present and tight. There should be no loose connections. No black soot around my connections that could indicate a leak. Next, I'll come down even further to my water pump, sitting right here on the front of my engine. Easiest way to find your water pump is come from my radiator up here and follow the hose all the way down to the water pump. My water pump should be properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken. It should not be leaking. All nuts and bolts should be present and tight. And we'll also have to say that our water pump is belt driven. Down in here we have a belt. I'll push on it, I'll tug on it, I'll make sure that belt has no abrasions, bulges, or cuts. It's not worn or frayed, and it should not have any more than 3/4 of an inch deflection when pressed in the center. And now I'm gonna go over to my driver's side. All right, when I make it to my driver's side, I will again do a general overview of all my lines, wires, and hoses, making sure that everything is properly mounted and secured. Nothing's cracked, bent, or broken. There's no loose connections, no frayed wires. I don't hear or see any leaks. And then I'll come down to my engine oil fill cap and my dipstick. I'll make sure that they are both properly mounted and secured. Neither are cracked, bent, or broken. The caps are on tight. Neither are leaking. I'll check my oil level by pulling out the dipstick, wiping it off, reinserting the dipstick, pulling it back out again, and making sure it reads between fill and max. Now we're going to slide inward here. I'm going to check my alternator. This is my alternator. I'll make sure that my alternator is properly mounted and secured. It's not cracked, bent, or broken. All my nuts and bolts should be present and tight. There should be no frayed or chafed wires. And also my alternator is belt driven as well. So I'll give that belt a good push and a tug to make sure that it is properly mounted and secured. It should not be worn, torn, or frayed. And it should not have no more than 3/4 inch of deflection when pressed in the center. All right, next I'm going to come down to my power steering reservoir and my power steering hose. Both are properly mounted and secured. Neither are cracked, bent, or broken. My cap is on tight. Nuts and bolts should be present and tight. Should be filled to the proper operating level, and neither should be leaking. Also, my power steering hose should have no abrasions, bulges, or cuts. If I follow that power steering hose all the way down and behind my frame, it'll lead me to my power steering pump. My power steering pump, located behind the frame, should be properly mounted and secured. It's not cracked, bent, or broken. It should not be leaking. And also, we'll have to say that our power steering pump is gear driven. Also behind my frame and under my cab is my air compressor. My air compressor should be properly mounted and secured. It's not cracked, bent, or broken. It should not be leaking. And it's also gear driven. All right, we're gonna come down to our steering. The first thing I'll check is my steering rod. It's properly mounted and secured to my steering gearbox. Nothing's cracked, bent, or broken. All nuts and bolts should be present and tight. My U-joints on either end should be properly greased, not loose or worn. Then I'll come to my steering gearbox. I'll make sure it's properly mounted and secured to the frame of the truck. Nothing's cracked, bent, or broken. All nuts and bolts should be present and tight. Should not be leaking. All right, coming from my gearbox, I come out to my pitman arm, my drag link, my upper steering arm, all the way back here, my lower steering arm, my tie rod, and on either end is my tie rod ends. Again, that's my pitman arm, my drag link, upper steering arm, lower steering arm, tie rod, and on either end, my tie rod ends. They should all be properly mounted and secured. Nothing's cracked, bent, or broken. They should be held in place by castle nuts and cotter pins. I'll make sure my joints are properly greased and not loose or worn. All right, next we're gonna cover suspension. Up front, I have a front spring hanger, and I also have a rear hanger. Front and rear hangers. I have a main leaf spring. I have 2 U-bolts. And I have a shock absorber. All of these items should be properly mounted and secured. Nothing should be cracked, bent, or broken. All my nuts and bolts should be present and tight. My leaf springs should not be shifted nor misaligned. They should be sitting right on top of each other. My shock absorber should not be leaking, and my rubber bushings should be intact, top and bottom. Next, I have my brakes. I have my air lines, my brake chamber, which is held in place with a clamp. I have my push rod and my slack adjuster, which is held in place with pins and keepers. All those items should be properly mounted and secured. Nothing's cracked, bent, or broken. All nuts and bolts should be present and tight. My air lines and my brake chambers not leaking. My push rod and slack adjuster have no more than 1 inch deflection when my brakes are released. To round off my brake system, I come out to my brake drums and my brake pad. Brake drums and pads, both are properly mounted and secured. Nothing's cracked, bent, or broken. All nuts and bolts should be present and tight. My brake drums are free of any oil, grease, and debris. My brake pads are not worn dangerously thin or less than 1/4 inch. All right, so the last thing I'll check on part A is my steer tire. The way I check my tires, I use the acronym TCP. T stands for tread. I'll make sure that my tread is evenly worn to no less than 4/32 of an inch. There should be no extreme damage to the face of my tire. C is the condition. I'll check both inner and outer sidewalls of my tires, making sure there's no abrasions, no bulges or cuts, and there's no dry rot. And then P is for pressure. I'll check my air pressure with a air pressure gauge and make sure that it is filled to the proper operating level or the manufacturer's specifications. All right, next I'll check my rim. I'll check the outer and the inner side of my rim, making sure that it is properly mounted and secured. It is not cracked, bent, or broken, and there's no illegal welds on that rim. Then I'll check my valve stem. I'll make sure that it is properly mounted and secured. Should not be cracked, bent, or broken. Cap should be on tight and it should not be leaking. Next, I will come to my lug nuts. I'll make sure that my lug nuts are all properly mounted and secured. Nothing's cracked, bent, or broken. None are missing. There's no signs of looseness such as rust trails or shiny metal shavings. And then I will come down to my hub oil seal. I'll make sure that my oil seal is properly mounted and secured. Should not be cracked, bent, or broken. All my nuts and bolts should be present and tight. It should be filled to the proper operating level. And you can check that with the sight glass that this one is equipped with. And that completes part A.